The gunshot echoed across the plains as Lillian Vaughn clutched her swollen belly and urged her exhausted mare forward, the horizon blurring through her tears. She had been running for 3 days straight, fleeing from the man who had promised her the world, but delivered only pain and betrayal. Arizona Territory, 1885. The unforgiving summer sun beat down mercilessly as Lillian's horse stumbled on the rocky path. Her supplies had dwindled to nothing, and the water in her canteen had run dry hours ago. The baby inside her kicked vigorously, as if sensing its mother's desperation. "Just a little further," she whispered, though she had no idea where further led. The small settlement she'd spotted from the ridge was her only hope now. In the distance, a lone ranch house stood against the backdrop of the mountains, smoke curling from its chimney. A beacon of civilization in the vast emptiness. Lillian urged her horse toward it, praying that whoever lived there would show mercy to a woman in her condition. As she approached, she could make out a tall figure working in the corral beside the house. A man with broad shoulders and a worn Stetson pulled low over his eyes. He looked up at the sound of her approach, his hand instinctively moving to the gun at his hip. "Please," Lillian called out, her voice cracking from thirst. "I need help." The man took a step forward, his expression guarded but not unkind. "Madam?" Lillian slid from her saddle, her legs nearly buckling beneath her. The man moved with surprising speed, crossing the distance between them to catch her before she fell. "I'm sorry to trouble you," she managed, aware of how she must look dirty, exhausted, clearly with child and clearly alone. "I have nowhere else to go." The man's eyes, a startling shade of blue, took in her condition. "Let's get you inside," he said simply. His name, she would learn, was Thomas Vance. The ranch was his, inherited from his father who had staked the claim 15 years earlier. Now Thomas worked it alone, having lost his parents to influenza 3 winters past. "I can work," Lillian blurted out after he had given her water and a simple meal of beans and cornbread. "I'll work for shelter. I can cook and clean. I won't be a burden." Thomas studied her for a long moment, his gaze lingering on her rounded belly before meeting her eyes again. Something in his expression softened. "You'll stay as my wife," he said, the words falling between them like stones in still water. Lillian blinked, certain she had misheard him. "I beg your pardon?" "Not in truth," he clarified, his weathered face coloring slightly. "But in name. A woman in your condition. Alone. Folks talk. It would be better for you. Safer, if they believed you were my wife. At least until—" He gestured vaguely toward her stomach. "You would do that for a stranger?" Lillian asked, unable to keep the suspicion from her voice. Men's kindness, in her experience, always came with a price. "I have an extra room," Thomas said. "You can stay there. No expectations beyond the work you offered. When you're recovered and ready to move on, you can go with my blessing." The proposition was unexpected, but Lillian had few options. Her child would arrive within weeks, and she needed a safe place. A temporary marriage in name only seemed a small price to pay. "Thank you, Mr. Vance," she said finally. "I accept your offer." "Thomas," he corrected. "If we're to be husband and wife in the eyes of others, you should use my given name." Lillian nodded. "Thomas. And I'm Lillian." He extended his hand and she took it hesitantly. His palm was calloused but warm against hers, the touch gentle despite the strength evident in his frame. "Welcome to Double V Ranch, Mrs. Vance," he said, and for the first time in months, Lillian felt something like hope. The next morning, Lillian woke to the sound of activity in the kitchen. For a moment, disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings, panic seized her. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, her arrival at the ranch, Thomas Vance's unexpected offer. She dressed quickly in the same travel-worn clothes she'd been wearing for days and made her way to the kitchen. Thomas stood at the stove, frying bacon in a cast-iron skillet. "Good morning," she said, hovering in the doorway. He turned, nodding in acknowledgement. "Hope you're hungry. Got eggs from the chickens this morning." "I can cook," Lillian offered, moving toward him. "You've been kind enough to take me in. The least I can do is prepare the meals." Thomas hesitated before stepping aside. "Been cooking for myself since I was 14. Wouldn't mind a change." As Lillian took over at the stove, Thomas sat at the rough-hewn table, watching her with quiet curiosity. "How far along are you?" he asked after a moment. "About 8 months, I think," Lillian replied, keeping her eyes on the task at hand. "The baby should come in a few weeks." Thomas nodded. "There's a midwife in town, Mrs. Halloran. I'll ride out today and let her know we might need her services soon." "And will you tell her," Lillian began, "that I've taken a wife?" "Yes." Thomas's expression remained neutral. "It's best if everyone believes the story from the start. What will you tell them about why no one knew? About why there was no wedding?" Thomas considered this. "We met when I was delivering cattle in Tucson. Quick courtship, small ceremony. You've been living in town until I could prepare the house for a woman's comfort." He shrugged. "People mind their business for the most part." After breakfast, Thomas showed Lillian around the ranch. It was modest but well-maintained, a testament to his hard work. The main house had 3 rooms, the kitchen that doubled as a dining and living area, Thomas's bedroom, and the smaller room where Lillian had spent the night. Behind the house was a vegetable garden, somewhat neglected but still producing. A chicken coop housed a dozen hens and a rooster. The barn sheltered 2 horses besides Lillian's mare, a milk cow, and a few head of cattle. "It's not much," Thomas said, almost apologetically. "It's more than I hoped for," Lillian replied honestly. When Thomas rode into town that afternoon, Lillian set about making the house more livable. She swept floors that hadn't seen a broom in months, washed windows clouded with dust, and aired out linens that smelled of disuse. In the pantry, she found basic supplies, flour, sugar, coffee, dried beans, and began planning what she might prepare for supper. The garden yielded potatoes, carrots, and a few tomatoes, enough to make a hearty stew. By the time Thomas returned, the house smelled of cooking food and fresh air. He paused in the doorway, taking in the transformation. "You've been busy," he observed. Lillian wiped her hands on her apron, one she'd found hanging on a hook by the stove. "I wanted to earn my keep." Thomas set a package on the table. "Brought you some things from the mercantile. Nothing fancy, but the storekeeper's wife helped pick out what a woman in your condition might need." Lillian unwrapped the bundle to find 2 simple cotton dresses with room for her expanding waistline, undergarments, a hairbrush, and a bar of lavender soap. "You didn't need to do this," she said softly. "A man would buy such things for his wife." Thomas removed his hat, hanging it by the door. "And Mrs. Peterson at the store would have thought it strange if I didn't." "How much do I owe you?" Lillian asked. Thomas shook his head. "Nothing. Consider it part of our arrangement." That night, after a meal eaten mostly in companionable silence, Thomas excused himself to the porch while Lillian washed the dishes. When she finished, she found him smoking a cigarette, his gaze fixed on the stars scattered across the vast desert sky. "May I join you?" she asked. He nodded, shifting to make room for her on the bench. For several minutes, they sat without speaking. The night was cool, a welcome relief from the day's heat. "Thank you," Lillian said finally, "for the clothes, for the shelter, for all of it." Thomas tapped ash from his cigarette. "What brings a woman in your condition to ride alone through the territory?" he asked, then quickly added, "You don't have to tell me if you don't want to." Lillian hesitated. She owed him some explanation, but the truth was ugly and complicated. "I was married," she began, "in St. Louis. My husband Richard," heard about silver strikes in the Arizona territory, and convinced me to come west with him. He had dreams of making a fortune. She paused, gathering her courage to continue. The mining camp was a terrible place. Rough men, little shelter, disease everywhere. When I discovered I was with child, Richard changed. Started drinking more, gambling what little money we had. He became cruel. Lillian's hand unconsciously moved to her cheek, where a faded bruise still lingered. When I threatened to leave, to return east, she couldn't finish. You don't need to say more, Thomas said quietly. I fled in the night, Lillian continued anyway, needing to unburden herself. Took his horse and what supplies I could carry. I've been riding for days, afraid he might be following. Thomas was silent for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was low but firm. You're safe here, Lillian. I give you my word. The conviction in his voice made her throat tighten with unexpected emotion. You're a good man, Thomas Vance. Not many would offer shelter to a stranger, let alone invent a marriage to protect her reputation. He shrugged, uncomfortable with the praise. My mother raised me to believe that a man's worth is measured by how he treats those in need. He stood, extinguishing his cigarette. We should turn in. Morning comes early on a ranch. As Lillian lay in bed that night, she placed a hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movements beneath her palm. For the first time in months, she slept without fear. The days fell into a rhythm as Lillian adapted to life at Double V Ranch. Thomas rose before dawn to tend to the livestock, while Lillian prepared breakfast and managed the household. Despite her advancing pregnancy, she insisted on contributing, finding ways to work around her growing limitations. A week after her arrival, Thomas announced they would be attending Sunday services in town. People will expect to see my new wife, he explained. Better to establish our story now than have rumors start. Lillian felt a flutter of anxiety at the prospect of facing strangers, but she understood the necessity. She wore one of the dresses Thomas had purchased, her hair neatly pinned beneath a borrowed bonnet. The small church in Cottonwood Springs was filled with ranchers, shopkeepers, and their families. Lillian felt their curious gazes as she walked in on Thomas's arm. Thomas Vance, a portly man with impressive whiskers, greeted them. Heard you'd taken a wife. Didn't believe it until now. Mayor Peterson, Thomas nodded. This is Lillian. A pleasure, Mrs. Keough, Vance, the mayor said, his wife appearing at his side. Quite a surprise to us all. Thomas has been a confirmed bachelor since he came of age. The right woman is worth waiting for, Thomas replied smoothly, his hand settling at the small of Lillian's back in a gesture that appeared protective and affectionate. Mrs. Peterson, a kind-faced woman in her 50s, took Lillian's arm. Come meet the other ladies while the men talk business. Lillian found herself surrounded by the women of Cottonwood Springs, all eager to meet the woman who had captured the elusive Thomas Vance. She answered their questions as truthfully as possible while maintaining the fiction Thomas had created. When is your baby due? Asked a young woman who introduced herself as Betsy Halloran, the midwife's daughter. A few more weeks, I believe, Lillian replied. Mother will be happy to assist when the time comes, Betsy said. She's delivered most of the babies in the county. Thomas mentioned her, Lillian nodded. I would be grateful for her help. And how did you and Thomas meet? Asked another woman, her tone suggesting she suspected there was more to the story than they'd been told. Before Lillian could answer, Thomas appeared at her side. Stealing my wife away already, ladies? He asked with an ease Lillian hadn't seen in him before. Service is about to begin. As they took their seats in a pew near the back, Thomas leaned close. You're doing fine, he murmured. They're just curious. Throughout the service, Lillian was acutely aware of Thomas beside her, the clean scent of soap, the warmth of his arm occasionally brushing hers. It felt strange to pretend intimacy with a man she barely knew, Yet there was comfort in his solid presence. After the service, they were invited to dine with the Petersons, but Thomas politely declined. "My wife tires easily these days," he explained. "Another time, perhaps." On the ride home, Lillian let out a breath she felt she'd been holding all morning. "That was more difficult than I expected." "You handled it well," Thomas said. "They seemed to accept you readily enough." "Your friends were surprised you had married," Lillian observed. Thomas kept his eyes on the road. "Never had much interest in socializing. The ranch keeps me busy." "No young lady caught your eye?" Lillian asked, then immediately regretted her boldness. "I'm sorry, that's not my business." "There was someone once," Thomas said after a pause. "Catherine Whitfield. We were to be married 5 years ago." "What happened?" Lillian asked softly. "She changed her mind, decided she didn't want the life of a rancher's wife, married a banker from Phoenix instead." His voice held no bitterness, just a matter-of-fact acceptance. "I'm sorry," Lillian said. Thomas shrugged. "Worked out for the best. She'd have been unhappy here, and an unhappy wife makes for an unhappy home." The rest of the journey passed in silence, but it was a comfortable one. When they reached the ranch, Thomas helped Lillian down from the wagon, his hands strong and steady at her waist. For a brief moment, their eyes met, and Lillian felt an unexpected warmth spread through her chest. "Thank you for today," she said, stepping back. "For making me feel protected." Something flickered in Thomas's gaze, too quickly for Lillian to interpret. "It's what any decent man would do," he replied. But as Lillian watched him lead the horses to the barn, she wondered if Thomas Vance was perhaps more than just a decent man. He was becoming something dangerously close to a friend. As July gave way to August, the heat intensified. Thomas worked from dawn until the worst of the afternoon sun drove him indoors, then returned to his chores until dusk. Lillian worried about him working so hard in such conditions. "You'll make yourself ill," she scolded one evening as he came in, his shirt soaked with sweat, his face reddened from the sun. "Work doesn't stop for the weather," he replied, though he accepted the glass of cold well water she offered. "At least let me help more," Lillian insisted. "I'm not an invalid." Thomas glanced at her belly, which seemed to grow larger by the day. "You're doing plenty." "I could gather eggs, tend the garden properly, maybe even help with the milking," Lillian pressed. "I grew up on a farm in Missouri. I know my way around livestock." Thomas considered her for a moment. "The garden could use a woman's touch," he conceded, "and the chickens are gentle enough. But leave the heavier work to me." Lillian didn't argue, knowing it was a compromise. The next morning, she rose early and joined Thomas for breakfast before he headed out to the fields. After clearing the dishes, she made her way to the chicken coop, basket in hand. The simple task of collecting eggs brought an unexpected sense of normalcy. For a little while, she could almost forget the circumstances that had brought her here, the fear, the flight, the uncertainty of her future. As she moved on to the garden, she saw that despite Thomas's efforts, many of the plants were struggling in the harsh desert conditions. Lillian set about weeding, watering, and nurturing the vegetables that remained. By midday, sweat trickled down her back, and the baby seemed to be practicing somersaults inside her. She was resting in the shade of the porch when she heard the sound of approaching hooves. Instinctively, she tensed, her hand moving to her swollen belly in a protective gesture. A rider appeared on the horizon, moving at a steady pace toward the ranch. It wasn't Thomas. He had taken the wagon to town for supplies. As the figure drew closer, Lillian could make out a woman on horseback. The visitor reined in her mount near the house and dismounted with the ease of someone accustomed to riding. She was perhaps 50, her face weathered by sun and time, her gray-streaked hair pulled back in a practical bun. "You must be Mrs. Vance," the woman called out. "I'm Eliza Halloran, the midwife." Relief washed over Lillian. Mrs. Halloran, yes. Thomas mentioned you would be coming. The midwife approached, her keen eyes taking in Lillian's condition. He asked if I might check on you. First babies can be unpredictable, and he was concerned, given how far you are from town. Lillian invited the woman inside, offering her water and the shade of the house. As they sat at the kitchen table, Mrs. Halloran asked questions about Lillian's health, her previous experience with childbirth in her family, and how she was feeling. "May I?" the midwife asked, gesturing to Lillian's belly. Lillian nodded, and Mrs. Halloran's practiced hands gently palpated her abdomen, feeling the position of the baby. "Strong little one," she commented with approval. "Head down already, which is good. I'd say you have 3 weeks, perhaps less." "So soon?" Lillian asked, a flutter of anxiety rising in her chest. "Babies come when they're ready," Mrs. Halloran said pragmatically. "But everything feels as it should. You're healthy. The baby is in position. I don't anticipate any problems." As the midwife prepared to leave, she paused. "It's not my place to pry, Mrs. Vance, but I've been delivering babies in this county for 30 years. I can usually tell when a couple has been together a while." Her expression was kind but knowing. "Whatever your circumstances, your secret is safe with me. My concern is only for you and the child." Lillian felt tears sting her eyes, moved by the woman's discretion and compassion. "Thank you," she whispered. Mrs. Halloran squeezed her hand. "Thomas Vance is a good man, one of the best I know. Whatever arrangement you two have, I believe you're in safe hands." After the midwife departed, Lillian sat on the porch, contemplating her words. She had known Thomas barely a month, yet in that time he had shown her more kindness than Richard had in their entire marriage. She was still sitting there when Thomas returned from town, the wagon loaded with supplies. He looked concerned when he saw her expression. "Everything all right?" he asked, jumping down from the wagon. "Was that Mrs. Halloran leaving?" Lillian nodded. "She checked on the baby, said everything looks good, but that it might come sooner than I expected." Thomas's face showed a mixture of relief and something like panic. "How soon? 3 weeks? Maybe less?" He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Lillian had come to recognize as a sign of him processing information. "I'll make sure the room is ready, and we should keep the wagon prepared in case we need to fetch her quickly." "Thomas," Lillian said softly, "Mrs. Halloran knows. About us. That we're not really married." His expression grew serious. "Did she say something?" "Just that our secret was safe with her. She said—" Lillian hesitated. "She said you're a good man, and that I'm in safe hands." Something unreadable crossed Thomas's face. "She's known me since I was a boy. Probably feels responsible for me in some way." "She's right, though," Lillian said, holding his gaze. "You are a good man. Better than I had any right to expect when I rode onto your land." Thomas looked uncomfortable with the praise, as he always did. "Let me get these supplies unloaded before the heat ruins the perishables," he said, changing the subject. As Lillian helped him bring in the groceries, their hands brushed accidentally as they both reached for the same sack of flour. The contact was brief, but sent an unexpected current through Lillian's body. She stepped back quickly, murmuring an apology. Thomas cleared his throat. "I ran into some neighbors in town. The Mitchells. They've invited us to supper tomorrow night." "Oh," Lillian said, surprised. "Do you think we should go?" "Might look strange if we refused. They're our closest neighbors, only about 3 miles east." Lillian nodded. "Then we should accept." That night, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the desert in hues of gold and crimson, Lillian found herself studying Thomas's profile. The strong jaw, the straight nose, the lines at the corners of his eyes that suggested he had once smiled more frequently than he did now. "Tell me about your parents," she said, breaking the comfortable silence. Thomas looked surprised by the question but answered readily enough. My father was from Kentucky originally, came west after the war between the states, like many did, met my mother in California. She was a schoolteacher there. What brought them here? The dream of land, I suppose, a place of their own. My father heard about the Homestead Act, decided to stake a claim. Thomas gestured to the land around them. Started with 160 acres and the cabin that used to stand where this house is now. Built it up over time. They must have been remarkable people, Lillian observed. A small smile touched Thomas's lips. They were. Stubborn as mules, both of them. But fair and hardworking. Taught me everything I know about ranching, about life. And you've been alone since they passed? Lillian asked gently. Thomas nodded. 3 years now. Ranch keeps me busy enough that I don't notice the quiet most days. And now I've disrupted that quiet, Lillian said, half joking. Thomas turned to look at her, his expression serious. Some disruptions are welcome ones. The simple statement hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning that neither was ready to examine too closely. Lillian felt her cheeks warm and blamed it on the lingering heat of the day. I should turn in, she said, rising carefully. If we're to visit your neighbors tomorrow, I want to be rested. Thomas stood as well, offering his arm to help her up the porch steps. Sleep well, Lillian. Good night, Thomas, she replied, and if her hand lingered on his arm a moment longer than necessary, neither of them acknowledged it. The next evening, Thomas and Lillian made the short journey to the Mitchell Ranch in the wagon. Lillian wore her best dress, which wasn't saying much, given her limited wardrobe, and had pinned her hair carefully, wanting to make a good impression. The Mitchells' home was larger than the Double V Ranch house, with a wide veranda and glass windows. A woman about Lillian's age hurried out to greet them as Thomas helped Lillian down from the wagon. You must be Lillian, she said warmly. I'm Sarah Mitchell. We've been so eager to meet Thomas's wife. He's kept you quite a secret. Thomas shook hands with Robert Mitchell, a tall man with a friendly face, as Sarah ushered Lillian inside. The house was comfortably furnished, with evidence of children's toys quickly tidied away, crayon drawings pinned to the wall. Our boys are already in bed, Sarah explained. They're 5 and 7, and absolute terrors by sundown if they don't get their rest. Dinner was a pleasant affair, roast beef, potatoes, fresh bread, and apple pie for dessert. The conversation flowed easily, with Robert and Thomas discussing cattle prices and water rights, while Sarah asked Lillian about her background. Lillian stuck to the story Thomas had crafted, adding details from her real life in Missouri to make it more convincing. Sarah seemed to accept it without question, more interested in offering advice about childbirth and infant care. How long have you two been married? Robert asked over coffee. Thomas glanced at Lillian. Just shy of a year, he answered smoothly. A whirlwind romance, then, Sarah said with a smile. Given how far along you are? Lillian felt her face flush. Yes, we didn't see any reason to wait once we knew how we felt. The right person has a way of making decisions easy, Robert said, reaching for his wife's hand across the table. The gesture, so casual yet intimate, made Lillian's chest tighten with a strange longing. She had never experienced that kind of easy affection with Richard. Their marriage had been one of convenience, arranged by their parents, without love or even much liking between them. On the ride home, stars blanketed the desert sky, the moon illuminating the landscape in silver light. Lillian sat close to Thomas on the wagon seat, the night air having grown cool. They seem like good people, she observed. They are, Thomas agreed. Robert helped me rebuild the barn after a storm took the roof off 2 years ago. Wouldn't accept payment either. Sarah invited me to tea next week, Lillian said. I hope that's all right. Thomas glanced at her. You don't need my permission, Lillian. This is your home too, for as long as you want it to be. The words, your home, settled in Lillian's heart like a warm coal. Home. She hadn't had a real one in so long. The thought of leaving after the baby was born suddenly seemed less appealing than it had before. Thank you, she said softly, for everything you've done, for making me feel welcome, for protecting me, for... She gestured vaguely to her stomach. For accepting us both. Thomas was quiet for a long moment. I know what it's like to be alone, he finally said. After my parents died, the silence in the house was like a living thing. Having you here? He paused, seeming to search for the right words. It reminds me what a home should feel like. The admission, so plainly stated yet clearly difficult for him to express, moved Lillian deeply. Without thinking, she reached out and placed her hand over his where it rested on his thigh. Thomas looked down at their hands, then back to the road, but he didn't pull away. They rode the rest of the way in silence, Lillian's hand resting on his, connected by something neither of them was ready to name. As August wore on, the baby's impending arrival loomed larger in Lillian's thoughts. She found herself organizing and reorganizing the small room that would serve as a nursery, washing and rewashing the few baby clothes she'd managed to sew from fabric Thomas had brought from town. Thomas observed her nesting with a mixture of amusement and concern. You should rest more, he suggested one afternoon, as she folded tiny garments for the third time that day. I can't seem to sit still, Lillian admitted. Every time I try to relax, I think of another thing that needs doing before the baby comes. Thomas leaned against the doorframe. What else do you need? I can ride into town tomorrow? Lillian considered the question. A basin for bathing the baby. More blankets, perhaps. And... She hesitated, embarrassed. Some clothes for myself. After the birth, I mean. These won't fit, and the ones I came in are practically rags now. Make a list, Thomas said. I'll get whatever you need. That evening, as they sat at the kitchen table, Thomas clearing away the supper dishes while Lillian wrote her list, she felt a sharp pain low in her belly. She gasped, her hand flying to her abdomen. Thomas was at her side immediately. What is it? The baby? Lillian took a deep breath as the pain subsided. Just a twinge. Mrs. Halloran said I might feel them as the time gets closer. But an hour later, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, another pain came, stronger than the first. Lillian couldn't hide her discomfort this time. That's more than a twinge, Thomas observed, his face tight with concern. It's too early, Lillian said, though she knew babies rarely adhered to schedules. Mrs. Halloran said 3 weeks. Babies come when they're ready, Thomas echoed the midwife's words. I should ride for her now, before it gets too dark. Lillian wanted to argue that it might be a false alarm, but another contraction seized her, answering the question. She nodded, gripping the arms of her chair until the pain passed. Thomas was already moving, gathering what she would need inside. Can you walk to the bedroom? I'll help you get settled before I go. The next hour passed in a blur of activity. Thomas helped Lillian to bed, brought water and clean linens, and made sure the lamp was filled with oil. His efficiency suggested a man used to handling emergencies alone. I'll be back as quickly as I can, he promised, pausing at the bedroom door. Will you be all right until then? Lillian nodded, trying to appear braver than she felt. I'll be fine. The pains are still far apart. Thomas hesitated, then crossed the room to her bedside. To Lillian's surprise, he took her hand and pressed it firmly between both of his. You're stronger than you know, Lillian Vance, he said, his blue eyes intense. I believe in you. Before she could respond, he was gone, the sound of his horse's hooves fading into the night. Lillian lay back against the pillows, his words echoing in her mind. You're stronger than you know. The night stretched endlessly as Lillian's labor progressed. The pains came closer together, growing in intensity until she could barely catch her breath between them. She paced the room when she could, rested when she couldn't, and tried to remember everything she'd heard about childbirth. It was past midnight when she heard horses approaching. Relief flooded through her as voices reached her ears. Thomas and Mrs. Halloran. The midwife bustled in, bringing an air of calm competence with her. "Well now, this little one is eager to meet the world," she said after examining Lillian. "You're doing fine, my dear. Not long now." Thomas hovered in the doorway, uncertain. "Is there anything I can do?" "Boil water," Mrs. Halloran instructed. "Lots of it. And then wait outside. This is women's work now." As another contraction seized her, Lillian reached out blindly. "Thomas," she gasped. He was beside her in an instant, taking her hand. Lillian clutched it like a lifeline, drawing strength from his steady presence. Mrs. Halloran raised an eyebrow but didn't object. "You can stay if she wants you," she told Thomas, "but only if you think you can handle it." Thomas's face was pale, but his voice was firm. "I'll stay." What followed was the most difficult and miraculous night of Lillian's life. Hours of pain, of pushing, of feeling her body work to bring new life into the world. Throughout it all, Thomas remained at her side, holding her hand, wiping her brow, murmuring words of encouragement that she barely comprehended but drew comfort from nonetheless. As dawn broke over the desert, Lillian's daughter was born a small but healthy baby with a shock of dark hair and a lusty cry that filled the room. "A beautiful girl," Mrs. Halloran announced, cleaning and swaddling the infant before placing her in Lillian's arms. Lillian stared down at her daughter's face, overwhelmed by love so fierce it took her breath away. Tears streamed down her cheeks as she traced a finger over the baby's perfect features. "She's amazing," Thomas said softly from beside her, his voice thick with emotion. Lillian looked up at him, seeing the wonder in his eyes as he gazed at the child. In that moment, something shifted between them, a connection forged through shared experience, through the miracle they had witnessed together. "Would you like to hold her?" Lillian asked. Thomas looked startled. "I've never held a baby before." "There's nothing to it," Mrs. Halloran said, already moving to place the infant in his arms. "Support the head, that's right." Thomas cradled the tiny bundle with such gentle care that Lillian's heart constricted. He looked down at the baby with an expression of awe and something else, a tenderness Lillian had glimpsed in rare moments but never so openly displayed. "What will you call her?" he asked, his eyes still on the child. Lillian hadn't given much thought to names, assuming she had more time. But looking at her daughter now, cradled in Thomas's strong arms, one name came to mind. "Eleanor," she said, "after my grandmother." "Eleanor Grace." "Eleanor Grace," Thomas repeated softly. "It suits her." Mrs. Halloran, who had been quietly cleaning up, nodded approval. "A fine name for a fine girl. Now, Mrs. Vance needs rest, and this little one will be hungry soon." The days following Eleanor's birth passed in a haze of exhaustion and joy for Lillian. The baby proved to have healthy lungs and a hearty appetite, keeping her mother occupied with frequent feedings day and night. Thomas adapted to the new presence in his home with surprising ease. He moved through his daily routine quietly, careful not to disturb Lillian and the baby when they slept. But Lillian noticed that he found reasons to come to the house more often than before, checking on them between chores. A week after the birth, Lillian was sitting in a rocking chair on the porch, nursing Eleanor, when Thomas returned from the fields. He paused at the sight of them, removing his hat. "Am I intruding?" he asked. "Not at all," Lillian assured him. "Please join us." Thomas sat in the chair beside hers, his gaze drifting to the baby. "She's growing already," he observed. "Like a weed," Lillian agreed with a smile. "Mrs. Halloran says she's thriving." Thomas nodded, watching as Eleanor's tiny hand curled around her mother's finger. "You're good with her," Natural. I was terrified at first, Lillian admitted. I still am, sometimes. There's so much I don't know about being a mother. You'll learn together, Thomas said simply. They sat in comfortable silence as Eleanor finished nursing. Lillian adjusted her clothing and shifted the baby to her shoulder to burp her. Would you like to hold her? She offered, noticing Thomas's gaze lingering on the child. He hesitated only briefly before nodding. Lillian carefully transferred Eleanor to his arms, their hands brushing in the exchange. The baby settled against Thomas's chest, her eyes still the dark blue of newborns blinking up at him. "Hello, little one," he said softly. "You're causing quite a stir around here." Lillian watched them together, struck by how natural Thomas looked with a baby in his arms, not at all the awkward bachelor she might have expected. There was a gentleness to him that she found increasingly appealing. "I've been thinking," Thomas said, his eyes still on Eleanor. "The story we've been telling people about being married. It protects your reputation, but what about hers?" He nodded toward the baby. "What do you mean?" Lillian asked. "If people believe we're married, then she's my daughter in their eyes. She'll grow up with my name, with a father." Thomas looked up, meeting Lillian's gaze. "But if the truth ever comes out, or when you decide to move on?" The thought of leaving had crossed Lillian's mind less and less frequently since Eleanor's birth. The idea of starting over somewhere new, alone with an infant, was daunting. And if she was honest with herself, there was another reason she was reluctant to think about leaving the man sitting beside her, cradling her daughter with such care. "I haven't given much thought to moving on," Lillian admitted. "Not recently." Something flickered in Thomas's eyes. Relief? Hope? "You're welcome to stay as long as you like, both of you." "That's very generous," Lillian said, "but I can't impose on you indefinitely. This arrangement, it's not fair to you, Thomas. You deserve a real wife, a family of your own." Thomas was quiet for a long moment, his thumb gently stroking Eleanor's cheek as she dozed in his arms. When he spoke, his voice was low, measured. "What if I told you I've grown accustomed to having you here, that the thought of you leaving—" He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "It doesn't sit well with me." Lillian's heart beat faster at his words. "Thomas, what are you saying?" "I'm not good with words, Lillian. Never have been." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "But these past weeks, having you here, it's felt right. Like the house is finally a home." Lillian felt tears prick her eyes. "It's felt that way for me too," she whispered. Thomas shifted Eleanor carefully in his arms, reaching out with his free hand to take Lillian's. "I know this started as a convenient arrangement, a way to protect you and the baby, but it's become more than that for me." "For me as well," Lillian admitted, her voice barely audible. "I'm not Richard," Thomas said, his expression earnest. "I would never hurt you, never raise a hand to you. I would treat Eleanor as my own, because in my heart, she already is." Lillian couldn't stop the tears that spilled down her cheeks. "Thomas, I'm asking if you would consider staying, not as a temporary arrangement but permanently, as my wife in truth, not just in name." His hand tightened around hers. "I can't offer much beyond this ranch and my promise to care for you both, but it comes with my whole heart." The sincerity in his voice, the earnestness in his eyes, Lillian had never experienced anything like it. Richard's proposal had been a business transaction, cold and practical. This was something else entirely. "Are you certain?" she asked. "This isn't obligation talking? Because Eleanor and I would be fine on our own if need be." "I know you would," Thomas said, a small smile touching his lips. "You're the strongest woman I've ever met, Lillian Vance. You don't need me, but I'm hoping you might want me anyway." Lillian looked at this man who had opened his home and his heart to her when she had nothing to offer in return, who had stood by her through childbirth, who looked at her daughter with love in his eyes. The answer was simpler than she had expected. "Yes," she said, her voice steady despite her tears. "Yes, I would like to stay. To be your wife, in truth." Thomas's smile spread slowly, transforming his usually serious face. He leaned forward, careful of the baby in his arms, and pressed his forehead to Lillian's. "Thank you," he whispered. They remained like that for a moment, connected, the sleeping baby between them. Then Thomas pulled back slightly, his eyes questioning. Lillian nodded, understanding his unspoken request. His kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then more confident as Lillian responded. It was a promise, a beginning, a foundation for the future they would build together. When they separated, Lillian laughed softly, wiping away her tears. "This is not how I imagined my life would turn out when I rode onto your land." "Nor I when I offered shelter to a pregnant stranger," Thomas agreed, his eyes crinkling with rare humor. "But I wouldn't change a thing." Eleanor stirred between them, making small noises of discontent. Lillian took her back, soothing her with gentle pats. "We should speak to the Reverend," Thomas said. "Make it official, though as far as the town is concerned, we're already married." "A private ceremony," Lillian agreed. "Just for us." Thomas nodded, reaching out to touch Eleanor's dark hair. "For all three of us." The Reverend from Cottonwood Springs was more than happy to perform a blessing for the Vance family when Thomas approached him the following Sunday. If he suspected their marriage wasn't as established as they claimed, he gave no indication of it. The ceremony took place on a clear September morning, with only Mrs. Halloran and the Mitchells as witnesses. Lillian wore a new dress of pale blue, ordered specially from the Mercantile, with Eleanor in her arms dressed in a white gown Sarah Mitchell had gifted them. Standing before the Reverend on the porch of what was now truly her home, Lillian felt none of the apprehension she had experienced at her first wedding. Instead, a sense of rightness filled her as she looked into Thomas's eyes and repeated vows she meant with her whole heart. "I now pronounce you husband and wife," the Reverend said, though as far as their neighbors knew, they already were. "What God has joined together, let no man put asunder." Thomas kissed her then. A proper kiss that made Sarah Mitchell sigh appreciatively, and Robert clap him on the back afterward. "About time you found yourself a good woman," Robert told Thomas as they shared a celebratory meal. "Never seen the double V looking so welcoming." "It's Lillian's doing," Thomas replied, his eyes finding hers across the table. "She's made it a home." That night, after their guests had departed and Eleanor was sleeping soundly in her cradle, Thomas and Lillian stood somewhat awkwardly in the doorway of what had been his bedroom. "We don't have to," Thomas began, clearly worried about rushing her. Lillian silenced him with a finger to his lips. "I want to be your wife in every way, Thomas. I trust you." The words seemed to touch him deeply. He took her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "I'll spend my life earning that trust," he promised. Their first night together as husband and wife was a revelation for Lillian. Where Richard had been demanding and selfish, Thomas was attentive and gentle. He treated her body with reverence, discovering what pleased her, putting her comfort before his own desire. In his arms, Lillian found a passion she hadn't known existed, a connection that went beyond the physical to touch something deeper in her soul. Afterward, lying beside him with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, she felt a contentment she had never experienced before. "I never knew it could be like this," she whispered. Thomas's arms tightened around her. "Nor I," he admitted. "You're a wonder, Lillian Vance." The name, now legally hers, brought a smile to her lips. "I like the sound of that." Lillian Vance. It always seemed right to me, Thomas said, pressing a kiss to her hair. From the first day. Fall brought cooler temperatures to the Arizona territory and new routines to the Vance household. Eleanor grew stronger daily, her personality emerging curious, determined, with a smile that could melt the sternest heart. Thomas was besotted with her, often carrying her with him as he did chores around the house, talking to her as if she understood every word. Lillian blossomed as well, gaining confidence in her role as wife, mother, and partner in the ranch's operations. She started a larger vegetable garden, planted flower beds around the house, and even began keeping accounts for the ranch, discovering she had a head for numbers that Thomas appreciated. Their neighbors and the townspeople fully accepted them as a family now, any initial curiosity about their sudden marriage forgotten. Mrs. Peterson from the mercantile often saved special items for that sweet Vance baby, and Reverend Collins asked after Eleanor every Sunday. As Christmas approached, Thomas spent long hours in the barn, refusing to let Lillian see what he was working on. On Christmas Eve, after Eleanor was asleep, he led Lillian to the parlor where a small pine tree stood decorated with paper ornaments and candles. "Merry Christmas," he said, clearly pleased with her surprised reaction. "It's beautiful," Lillian breathed, touching one of the ornaments, a star cut from tin and polished to shine. "Did you make these?" Thomas nodded, a hint of color in his cheeks. "My mother always insisted on a tree, even out here where pines don't grow naturally. Had to ride up into the hills to find this one." Beneath the tree sat a large object covered with a blanket. Thomas gestured to it. "Your gift." Lillian removed the blanket to reveal a cradle, more elaborate than the simple one Eleanor currently used. It was beautifully crafted from oak, with intricate carvings along the sides, flowers, stars, and in the center of the headboard, the letters EGV for Eleanor Grace Vance. "Thomas," Lillian whispered, running her fingers over the smooth wood. "It's exquisite." "I started it the day she was born," he admitted. "Worked on it whenever I could find time." Lillian rose to embrace him, overwhelmed by the love evident in every detail of the gift. "Thank you. It's perfect." Thomas held her close. "I have something else for you," he said, reaching into his pocket. He withdrew a small object and placed it in her palm, a simple gold band, with a small pearl set in the center. "A proper wedding ring," he explained. "I should have given you one sooner." Lillian stared at the ring, tears blurring her vision. "It's beautiful." Thomas took it from her hand and slid it onto her finger. "To make it official," he said, "though you've been my wife in my heart since the day Eleanor was born." "I have something for you too," Lillian said, retrieving a package from where she'd hidden it behind a chair. Thomas unwrapped it to find a new shirt she had sewn, finer than any he owned, with careful stitching along the collar and cuffs. Beneath it lay a leather-bound journal. "For your thoughts," Lillian explained. "You once told me you're not good with words. But I think you have more to say than you realize." Thomas thumbed through the blank pages, visibly moved by the gesture. "Thank you," he said simply, but the look in his eyes conveyed far more. They sat together beside the tree, the lamplight casting a warm glow over the room. Thomas's arm around Lillian's shoulders, her head resting against him. "I never expected to be this happy," Lillian confessed. "When I fled from Richard, I thought my life was over. I was terrified, alone, with a child on the way and nowhere to go." "And now?" Thomas asked softly. Lillian looked up at him, at the face that had become dearer to her than any other. "Now I know it was just beginning." Spring came early to the Arizona territory the following year. The desert bloomed with wildflowers, and the Double V Ranch prospered under the care of Thomas and Lillian. Eleanor, now 8 months old, was crawling everywhere, keeping her parents constantly alert to her adventures. On a warm April evening, Thomas and Lillian sat on the porch swing he had built over the winter, watching the sunset while Eleanor played on a blanket at their feet. "I had a letter from the bank today," Thomas said, his arm around Lillian's shoulders. "The loan to expand the herd was approved. We can buy those cattle from the Simmons place next month." "That's wonderful news," Lillian said, leaning into him. "The accounts show we should turn a good profit this year if all goes well." "Speaking of accounts," Thomas said, a hint of mischief in his voice, "we may need to adjust our household budget soon." Lillian looked up at him questioningly. "Oh? Why's that?" Thomas placed a hand on her still flat stomach. "Just a hunch." Lillian's eyes widened. "How did you know?" "I wasn't certain myself until yesterday." "You've been tired in the evenings, and you couldn't stomach coffee at breakfast 3 days running." Thomas smiled. "I pay attention to my wife." Lillian covered his hand with hers, joy bubbling up inside her. "Another baby. Eleanor will have a brother or sister." "A growing family for a growing ranch," Thomas said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Nothing would make me happier." Eleanor chose that moment to pull herself up on the porch railing, taking her first wobbly stand unassisted. Both parents watched in delighted amazement as she balanced for a few seconds before plopping back down on the blanket, looking quite pleased with herself. "She's going to be walking before we know it," Lillian said, leaning down to scoop her daughter into her arms. "Aren't you, my clever girl?" Thomas watched them, his expression one of pure contentment. "I remember the day you rode onto my land," he said reflectively. "You offered to work for shelter, and I said you'd stay as my wife." "The best bargain I ever made," Lillian replied, reaching for his hand. "For me as well," Thomas agreed, squeezing her fingers gently. "For me as well." As the sun set over the desert, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, the Vance family sat together on their porch, bound not by a convenient arrangement or a hastily invented story, but by love that had grown naturally between them, as wild and true as the Arizona landscape that surrounded their home. Eleanor babbled happily in her mother's lap, reaching for her father with chubby hands. Thomas took his daughter onto his knee, bouncing her gently as Lillian leaned against his shoulder, her hand resting on her stomach where their second child grew. From desperate beginnings had come the greatest blessing of their lives, a family built on kindness, respect, and love that grew stronger with each passing day. What had started as shelter had become a home, and what had begun as a marriage in name only had become the truest union of hearts. As twilight deepened into night, Thomas pressed a kiss to Lillian's temple. "I love you," he said quietly, words that had once been difficult for him, now coming easily to his lips. "And I love you," Lillian replied, knowing with absolute certainty that no matter what challenges the future held, they would face them together, husband and wife, in every sense that mattered. The desert night settled around the Double V Ranch, stars appearing one by one in the vast sky. Inside the house that had become a home, a lamp burned in the window, casting its warm light into the darkness, a beacon of the love and life that had taken root and flourished in the wild heart of the Arizona territory. 5 years later, the Double V Ranch had grown almost beyond recognition. Additional pasture land had been purchased, the herd had tripled in size, and the main house had been expanded to accommodate the growing Vance family. Eleanor, now 6 years old, was the spitting image of her mother with the same determination and spirit. She adored her younger brother, Thomas Jr., known as TJ, who at 4 was already showing signs of being as capable and steady as his father. The newest addition, 1-year-old Margaret, toddled after her siblings with enviable energy. On a crisp October morning, Lillian stood on the porch watching Thomas teaching Eleanor to ride her own pony, a birthday gift he had surprised her with the previous week. The little girl sat tall in the saddle, her dark hair in braids beneath her small hat, her face a picture of concentration as she followed her father's instructions. TJ sat on the bottom porch step, carefully whittling a piece of wood with the small knife Thomas had given him, under his mother's watchful eye. Margaret napped in her cradle nearby, the same cradle Thomas had carved for Eleanor years before. As Lillian observed her family, contentment washed over her. The frightened, desperate woman who had fled an abusive husband seemed like someone from another lifetime. In her place stood a confident ranch wife, respected in the community, beloved by her husband, adored by her children. The sound of approaching riders drew her attention. Two figures on horseback appeared on the road leading to the ranch, a man and a woman. Visitors were common enough now that the Double V had established itself as one of the most prosperous ranches in the county. But something about these riders put Lillian on alert. "Thomas!" she called, her voice carrying across the yard. He looked up immediately, reading her concern. With a word to Eleanor to stay put, he walked his horse toward the house, arriving at the porch just as the visitors reached the yard. "Afternoon," Thomas greeted them, his hand resting casually near his holstered gun. "Something we can help you with?" The man removed his hat, revealing thinning hair and a face Lillian had hoped never to see again. Richard Blackwood. Her blood ran cold. Instinctively, she moved to stand in front of TJ, who looked up curiously at the strangers. "I'm looking for my wife," Richard said, his gaze fixing on Lillian. "Seems I've found her?" Thomas's posture stiffened, but his voice remained calm. "There's no one by that name here. This is my wife, Lillian Vance." Richard's companion, a hard-faced woman Lillian didn't recognize, snorted derisively. "That's Lillian Blackwood right there. Ran off with our money and his horse 5 years back. We've been tracking her for months." "Your money?" Lillian found her voice at last. "You gambled away everything we had. There was nothing left to take." Richard dismounted, his movements stiff as if from old injuries. "You took my horse, my gun, and the deed to our claim. Worth quite a bit now that the mine's producing." Lillian shook her head. "I took a horse that was half mine by right. Your gun, because I was afraid for my life, and there was no deed. You lost it in a poker game the week before I left. I heard you raging about it." Thomas stepped between them, his presence solid and reassuring. "Mr. Blackwood, if that's who you are, I suggest you state your business clearly, and then be on your way." Richard's face darkened with anger. "My business is my wife and the child she was carrying when she ran off. By law, they belong to me." Eleanor had ridden her pony closer to the house, sensing the tension. She looked between the adults with worried eyes. "Papa?" she called uncertainly. The simple word seemed to enrage Richard further. "So that's my daughter, is it? Calling another man Papa?" "Eleanor is my daughter in every way that matters," Thomas said, his voice dangerously quiet. "As are all our children. They bear my name, and they're under my protection." The woman with Richard spoke up. "The law's the law. A woman can't just run off from her husband and take up with another man. She's still legally married to Richard." "Actually, she's not," came a new voice. They all turned to see Robert Mitchell riding into the yard, the sheriff from Cottonwood Springs beside him. "Sorry to intrude, Thomas. Was riding with Sheriff Coleman here when we saw these folks heading your way. Thought they looked like trouble." The sheriff, a grizzled man in his 50s, dismounted and approached the group. "Tom, Lillian," he nodded to them before turning to Richard. "And you would be?" "Richard Blackwood. I've come for my wife and child." Sheriff Coleman's expression remained neutral. "Interesting claim, considering Lillian Vance has been legally married to Thomas here for over 5 years. Got the documentation to prove it." Confusion crossed Richard's face. "That's impossible. She was already married to me." "According to the records I've seen," the sheriff continued, "Lillian was widowed before she married Thomas. Papers came through from authorities in the mining town of Silver Creek. confirming one, Richard Blackwood died in a cave in at the Broken Spur mine. Lillian gasped. This was news to her as well. Richard's companion looked suddenly uneasy. Richard, you said she just ran off. Shut up, Martha, he snarled, then turned back to the sheriff. There's been some mistake. As you can see, I'm very much alive. Which makes me wonder why you've been using a dead man's name, Sheriff Coleman remarked. And why you're claiming to be the husband of a woman legally married to another man. Thomas moved to stand beside Lillian, his arm going around her waist. I think you should leave, he said to Richard, his voice firm but controlled for the sake of the children watching. Whatever you came here hoping to find, it's not yours to claim. Richard's hand moved toward his gun, but the sheriff was faster, his own weapon drawn and pointed. I wouldn't, Coleman advised. Impersonating a dead man, attempting to claim another man's wife, those are serious offenses. Add threatening a family with children present, and you're looking at serious time. For a tense moment, Richard seemed to consider his options. Then his shoulders slumped, defeat written in every line of his body. The mine really is producing? He asked Lillian, a pathetic note in his voice. I have no idea, she replied truthfully. I never went back. Never wanted to. The woman called Martha spat on the ground. Waste of time, just like I told you. Let's go before we end up in jail. Richard glared at Lillian one last time. You got lucky, he said bitterly. Found yourself a protector. Some women have all the fortune. It wasn't luck, Lillian replied, standing tall beside her husband. It was strength I didn't know I had, and kindness from a man who expected nothing in return. Something you would never understand. Sheriff Coleman gestured with his gun. I'll be escorting you two to the county line. If I see either of you in these parts again, I won't be so accommodating. As Richard and Martha mounted their horses, Eleanor ran to Lillian's side, wrapping her arms around her mother's waist. Mama, who are those people? Lillian stroked her daughter's hair. Just someone I knew a long time ago, sweetheart. They won't be coming back. They watched as the sheriff led Richard and Martha away, Robert Mitchell following behind to ensure they left without further incident. When they were out of sight, Thomas turned to Lillian, concern in his eyes. Are you all right? Lillian took a deep breath, then nodded. Yes. Strangely. Yes. Seeing him now, he seems so small. Nothing like the monster in my memories. Thomas gathered her into his arms, mindful of the children watching. You never told me you thought he was dead. I didn't know, Lillian admitted. There was talk of accidents at the mine all the time, but I was long gone before any cave-in. Someone must have mistaken another man for him. Or he staged his own death, Thomas suggested. To escape debts, perhaps. It doesn't matter now, Lillian said, drawing back to look at her husband, her real husband, the man who had won her heart not through force or fear, but through quiet strength and unwavering kindness. This is my life, you and our children. Nothing and no one can threaten that. Thomas kissed her forehead gently. Nothing and no one, he agreed. That night, after the children were asleep, Thomas and Lillian sat on their porch as they had countless evenings before. The encounter with Richard had shaken them both, bringing back memories Lillian had worked hard to bury. I was so afraid, she admitted, her head resting on Thomas's shoulder. Not of him, exactly, but of the past catching up to us, of losing everything we've built. Thomas's arm tightened around her. That could never happen. What we have? It's real, Lillian. More real than any paper or law. I know, she said, and she did. When I rode onto your land that day, offering to work for shelter, I never imagined finding a home, a true home. And when I said you'd stay as my wife, I never imagined finding the love of my life, Thomas replied, turning to face her. In the moonlight, his eyes were as earnest as they had been on the day he'd asked her to be his wife, in truth. "These 5 years have been the best of my life." Lillian reached up to touch his face, tracing the lines that hadn't been there when they met, lines earned through laughter and concern, through the full life they'd built together. "Mine too," she whispered, "and we have so many more ahead of us." Inside the house, their children slept peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they were loved and protected. Outside, the desert night wrapped around the Double V Ranch like a blanket, stars winking overhead in a timeless dance. Thomas kissed his wife, a kiss that held all the passion and tenderness of their years together, and the promise of all the years to come. "I love you, Lillian Vance," he murmured against her lips. "And I love you, Thomas Vance," she replied, "always." What had begun as a desperate plea, "I'll work for shelter," had blossomed into a love stronger than either of them could have imagined. A love built day by day, through hardship and joy, through childbirth and danger, through quiet evenings and busy mornings. A love as vast and enduring as the wild western landscape that had brought them together, and as real as the home they had created at the Double V Ranch.